Welcome to Fifth Quarter Bible. This is our Lesson 7 teaching video covering the book of Nehemiah, chapters 1 through 3, in our Return from Babylon teaching series. Again, I would encourage you, if you have not yet watched the intro video for this lesson, I would urge you to do that first so you can be prepared to go ahead and follow along with us here in our teaching lesson. As always, let's jump in with our themes, our overall themes for the entire series, and then we'll get specific into our lesson today. So in our Return from Babylon series, our overarching theme has been the faithfulness and sovereignty of God in keeping his covenant promise to bring salvation to all the people groups of the world through the promised seed of Abraham and before him, Eve. Again, this is all about God being a covenant keeping God and keeping his covenant promises to his people. And we have all these different covenants in the Old Testament, and this entire story is all of it. The entire return from Babylon is God keeping his covenant promise to a disobedient people that he had judged by putting them in exile. But from that, he keeps a remnant unto himself and keeps his promises through that remnant to one day bring a Messiah to save his people, his global, in a sense, people. And so, again, his sovereign hand was in the judgment that preceded our series and in the restoration that we have been covering in our teaching series. The remnant, again, this theme of a remnant, it will come up specifically in the text today, but this theme of him saving a remnant from the people, he always does that. And the people of God, even today, the church is a remnant of his creation, right? There's a group that he is saving, called the remnant, often in the Bible and in our theme, in our lesson. The temple, of course, equating to the presence of God. At this point in our lesson, I hate to say beyond the temple, but we've covered that primarily already in the book of Ezra, Haggai, the issue of the temple itself. We are now in Nehemiah going to be dealing more with the city and the walls. Now, of course, that affects the temple, and it affects what's happening in the temple. But we're not going to be dealing so much with the temple itself, just issues that would affect it. The primacy of the Word of God. We are going to see that. That's primarily associated with Ezra's ministry, being a priest. But we are still going to see that here as Nehemiah, who we'll see as a man of prayer, is going to really lean in to the Word of God and lean into God's promises. As he is confronting the people, confessing things to the Lord in prayer, etc. So that will be a definite topic here. And of course, the avoidance of idolatry. That was a primary theme in our last lesson at the end of the book of Ezra. It is important here. These walls, this physical separation we're going to be talking about with the walls of the city itself, it is there to keep the city separate from those outside of it. And we're going to run into some of those people outside of those walls in this lesson. So that being said, before we jump into the actual text, a couple points about Ezra and Nehemiah, since we're in this transitory time between these two books. Let's take a look at a couple main points that really hit both books. As we finished Ezra, now getting into Nehemiah, God works sovereignly through responsible, though flawed, both Ezra and Nehemiah, like everybody else, is flawed, human agents to accomplish his redemptive purposes. So he's using these men, and before them Zerubbabel and Jeshua, the prophets Haggai, Zechariah. He's using these men, as he has throughout all of human history, and extending into the church age today. To accomplish his redemptive purposes. And again, the key word I would say is redemptive. We need to remember that all of this that we're studying and reading is not just about a group of people being brought back to a land. This is all about the redemption of God's people. All of it. All of human history is about God redeeming his people unto himself. And so he does this through human agents, people that he has chosen, in this case, like these folks, to accomplish these purposes. Now, we do need to remember, though, that neither Ezra or Nehemiah was really able to bring the lasting changes needed in the hearts of God's people, the remnant. That would be left for the Messiah who was to come, which of course is Jesus. They are types pointing to Jesus in different ways, the things they were trying to do, the reforms they were making, the way they were confronting, in many cases, the people. These are things that point to Jesus, that show us aspects of who Jesus is going to be, just like many other of the even more famous characters in the Old Testament. Your Moses and your David were also types of Christ. But remember, none of these people fully encapsulate that, and none of them are really able to bring the lasting change. In this case, the changes that are really needed in the hearts of God's people. The Messiah would end up doing that. So, that being said, let's jump into Nehemiah chapter 1 now. Again, you should have read through these 3 chapters, looking for those specific things to look for, as we've called them in our previous lessons. And so as we go now to our next slide, in this particular PowerPoint, I've taken the time to highlight some of these specific things that I told you to look for and that we're going to be highlighting on our teaching slides. But here, if you look in verse 3, right, it mentions specifically a remnant. It mentions that they're in great trouble, and it mentions why are they in great trouble? Well, the walls are broken down, the gates are completely destroyed. So that's an important piece of information. And then as we get to the questions we had, right, well, how did we get to getting that information? Well, Nehemiah made an inquiry. Okay, if you look at verse 2, Nehemiah is going to ask about the condition of the Jewish remnant, right? There was a man, one of his brothers, Hanini, verse 2, came with men from Judah. And so then Nehemiah is going to ask about, well, how are they doing there? And he gets the report. Okay, and what was the report? Well, they're in great shame and trouble. They're in great shame and trouble. The walls are broken down. The gates are destroyed. And so Nehemiah hears this, and even though he's a member, if you listen to the intro video, correct, he's a member of the Persian court. He's the cupbearer to the king. You can go to the last verse of chapter 1 and see that. He's a very important man in the Persian court, but he is a Jew. And God has placed a real love and desire for the city of Jerusalem and for Judah as a whole to be in good condition, to be run well, for the people to be healthy, both physically, financially, emotional, and especially spiritually. And none of that is happening right now. This is at a down time in this return. And so he gets this report, and then we're going to see now in the rest of the chapter his reaction and response to this. So as we look at this next text, notice in verse 4, he wept and mourned. He continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And if you read through the rest of the chapter, it gives you more details on this response. It gives you details about his specific prayer to the Lord in these verses 5 through 11. And again, we'll give you some notes on that on the next slide. Do notice at the end of verse 11, I put it in blue there, a little different because it's sort of an extra piece of information that's important to know. Again, he was the cupbearer to the king. Being a cupbearer to the king would mean that he has the complete confidence of the king. The cupbearer is the one who's going to keep really, taste certain wines and things for the king to keep him from ever getting poisoned, amongst other responsibilities. And so this obviously has to be a very trusted person. And so that's his status there. But he hears about the people, he weeps, he mourns, he fasts, he prays, and we see his prayer. So specific notes for this again was, I asked you, well, look at Nehemiah's response and reaction. And as we saw on the previous slide, verse 4, he wept and he mourned. There was sadness, genuine sadness there about the condition of the people. And notice, he didn't just fast and pray, he continued fasting and praying. So it seems like he was already doing this. Whether he was just doing this for the people, or is this just a part of Nehemiah's life? He does seem to be and is often referred to as a man of prayer. We probably heard that said of people before, but this is a great compliment, biblically speaking, This is a man who sought the Lord in prayer and in fasting. And it seems like he didn't just do this now because of the report that he heard. It seems like this is something that he had already been doing. I would argue likely not just for Jerusalem and the condition of the people. Notice it was on his mind, right? That's why in verse 2 he asked about it. It was on his mind to ask it. So I think it's very plausible in the text that he was already praying and fasting about this. But I would also argue he's likely someone that just had a lifestyle of prayer and fasting. And so we see that in Nehemiah's life. So his response, he wept, he mourned. Okay. The reaction, he's fasting, he's praying. Well, what is this prayer and petition he makes to the Lord? Well, I'm going to give you some things that you can kind of place in your Bible there, or place in your notes. And then I would argue, read through this prayer a few times and see what little nuggets you can dig out, and application points even more you can dig out. But here's sort of your outline of the prayer, right? In verse 5, he praises the Lord. In verse 5, he praises the Lord, right? He calls him great and awesome, how he keeps covenant. Notice in verse 5, he keeps covenant. He has steadfast love. Remember, we talked about in the book of Ezra how that means covenant loyalty. He keeps covenant. He's loyal with those who love him and keep his commandments. And then in verses 6 through 7, we get the confession. We get the confession. And what's interesting about this is he's confessing for the people and the sins that they've committed, both past and present. But he's not really a part of that necessarily, specifically anyway. And so we do see, in a sense, him here taking the place of the sinner. Again, this is a very Christological type thing to do. This is what's one of the things that makes him a type. He sort of stands in that gap for the people and says what we have done, even though he wasn't really a part of that. That's exactly what Jesus is going to do on the cross, is take your sin upon himself, even though he didn't do it, right? So it's that type of thing, that type of thinking that we see here in this confession. And then as you continue, he makes his petition to the Lord on what he would like to see the Lord do, but he makes it based on his word. Notice verse 8, remember the word that you commanded your servants. Okay, Lord, hey, you made this promise, right? It's based on your word. I'm petitioning you based on that, Lord, to help. I'm petitioning you, right, on behalf of these people based on your word. It's not based on feelings or emotions or fairness or anything like that. It's simply based on, I trust your word, Lord. I trust your word. And then finally in verses 10 and 11, we get this intercessory, so the continuation, I would argue, even of him interceding for the people. But then we get a personal petition as well. As you look at verse 10 is more for the people, what they have done. And then notice verse 11, O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and the prayer of your servants who delight and fear your name. Give success to them today. I would argue this is a great, much like we have the Lord's Prayer in the Gospels that gives us sort of an outline of how to pray. This would be very similar to this, right? We're going to praise the Lord, extol his name. We're going to make confession, and then we'll make petition. I would argue first for others and then for ourselves. So this will be a great model for prayer as well. So as we transition into chapter 2, this is where we're at. Now he has this information. He's prayed to the Lord, but he still needs to find a way to get over to Jerusalem. And that's not a small thing. He's got a king who he's going to have to convince to let him go. So as we get into chapter 2, notice the king himself is going to see Nehemiah. Remember, they spent a lot of time together. He's the cupbearer. And he notices that Nehemiah is sad. Right? Look at verse 2. I put it in red there, right? Now, it tells you in the text itself that Nehemiah tried, if you look at verse 3, he tried to, verse 1, I apologize, right? At the end of verse 1, he tried purposely not to be sad in the king's presence, but the king could still tell. Was the king a wise and discerning man? Possibly. Was he good at reading people? Maybe. We do know that ultimately Nehemiah is going to be successful here, and this will be a specific note later, because we know that the hand of God is upon him. You're going to see that specifically in verses 8 and 18 here. That was a theme from our last lesson as well with Ezra and lessons before about the hand of God I mean, even I didn't even realize that before I started teaching this series here about how present the hand of God was. I mean, we know that as a general thing, but very specifically in these books and during these returns, it talks about the hand of God being upon his servant who he has called to lead at that particular time. So was that the reason why the king noticed his face was sad? Ultimately, yes, God is sovereign. But whatever the case may be, he notices his face is sad. And then notice Nehemiah's reaction is that he was much afraid. So on our next slide, where we give you some of the notes on this, we'll discuss, well, why? Why was he afraid when the king noticed he was sad? And then notice in verse 8 at the bottom, I put it in bold and read, for the good hand of my God was upon me. He's going to get a good response because God's hand is upon him. So as you look at our notes specifically for this, right, what was Nehemiah's disposition and request? Well, his demeanor was down because of the condition of the people of Judah and the city of Jerusalem. He was down even though he tried to hide it. Once the king asks him, why is your face down? He tells the king what's going on. Okay? But he was afraid, I told you. Why was he afraid to make this request to the king? The king could possibly get offended. Why? Well, we know from Ezra chapter 4 that this king had already issued a negative decree about Jerusalem. It's very possible the king could have seen Nehemiah's request as insubordinate, as something that was disrespectful, and he could have had Nehemiah killed on the spot. So this was something to be afraid of. We know from the Persian kings, remember in the book of Esther, right? How even Esther the queen had to be fearful approaching the king. And even this was a man that was in the king's presence a lot, usually not for this purpose, making a request like this of him that would really contradict in many ways a previous decree of his. So this was a terrifying thing. However, he is going to receive favor from the king. And why? We already told you, because the hand of God was on Nehemiah, verses 8 and 18. And I would argue that's the centerpiece of the whole story, not just these chapters, the entire book, the entire teaching series. The hand of God was upon these men that God chose to lead these people, this remnant, out of exile, back to Judah and Jerusalem to reestablish the temple, the city, the walls, and proper worship of God through his word. That would be your primary theme. Really, if we had to encapsulate all of them together, that would be it. That would be it. So as we continue through the chapter, though, we're going to face some opposition. So they get a favorable response from the king, but you're going to have opposition from the locals, namely two men there in verse 10 named Sanballat and Tobiah. Now, back in the book of Ezra, we dealt with this. And again, in Ezra chapter 4, it mentioned this period of time where you're going to face a really severe opposition to the rebuilding of these walls. Possibly the most severe opposition they face throughout the entire return comes here from these specific men and people. So, this opposition in verses 9 and 10, what's significant about it? Well, it's both religious and political. It's political because all things are political. These are different people groups. This is land that they had control of and were operating, and now the king is allowing the Jews to control and operate it. So that's a political thing. But it's also religious. The Jews have a very specific way of worshiping the Lord, right? They are monotheistic. Many of the people groups are polytheistic, but even if they're not, they certainly are not going to be worshiping the God of Israel in the proper way. As a matter of fact, this man Sanballat, his name means sin gives life. In this case, sin, or the moon god, right? It's interesting how those two things coincide, gives life. He came from the line of governors of the area known as Samaria, which of course is where we're going to get eventually, really already, but as time goes on even more so, the group of people known as the Samaritans, who of course will be in opposition to the Jewish people and the Jews who are in Jerusalem at the time that the Messiah comes. And Jesus himself in John chapter 4 is going to simply flat out say that salvation is of the Jews and that the Jews are right. Even though at the time their hearts were wrong, right? Their hearts were off, but they were right. They were right about where worship was, what true worship is, who the true God is. and these Samaritans are going to be wrong. And you see it even from way back here, this conflict between the Jews and the Samaritans. Now, Sanballat and this other man Tobiah, who was an Ammonite, and we know the Ammonite were one of the people groups who were enemies of Israel. They were likely syncretistic, okay? And this is ultimately what the Samaritans were. That would be where you try to incorporate some of the truths, or I mean, I guess in general, it just means combining two different religions, right? Two or more. And specifically here, what's going to end up happening with the Samaritans in particular is they will have some elements of Jewish worship, but they're going to mix it, right, with other things, with pagan religions and etc. And that makes sense. Again, these Samaritan people, this area of Samaria was the area conquered primarily by the Assyrians before the Babylonians eventually conquered the southern kingdom of Judah. And the Assyrians, rather than taking people into exile, like what happened to the group of people that we've been dealing with in this series, they simply flooded the area with themselves and many other people groups. And essentially you ended up with a ton of intermarriage in Samaria and parts north, which is where we get the Samaritan people, which again is what our last lesson, Ezra, the ending of the book of Ezra, the last two chapters of Ezra, was dealing with the issue of intermarriage. And that's why it was such a big deal not to intermarry, so they wouldn't end up like these people. So sorry for the long-winded explanation on that, but that's where this opposition is coming from. It's both religious and political. So as we look through the actual opposition, and then now Nehemiah is going to take a look at these city walls, inspect them, see the condition. He gets to Jerusalem, the king allows him to go, he faces some of the opposition, but he's going to inspect these walls. And what he finds is going to be, obviously the wall needs to be completely rebuilt. Now there's areas that are completely torn down and burned down, there's other areas that are partially there, but the wall as a whole needs to be rebuilt. And so the condition of the walls and what is the possible meaning of this, right? The wall, verse 13, the wall was broken down and completely destroyed in certain areas. So not good. And so the city itself was in ruins. If you don't have a border, you don't have a country. That might sound familiar from modern times. But really, to have the city itself thrive and be safe, you needed the walls up. That's what separated them from the other people groups. And there does need to be that separation between God's people and the world. And the wall, I do believe, is symbolic of that. And too often, this destruction of the walls and the way the walls are characterized, too often describe the spiritual condition of the Jews and God's remnant apart from Christ. Okay, that just describes us apart from Christ, because at that point we are worldly. At that point, we are not separate from the world. But once we're in Christ, we are separate. Back in the Old Testament, this would be more of a physical separation, right? Whereas in our time, it would be more of a spiritual separation now. Okay, that tends to be an Old Testament, New Testament interplaying theme, right? Physical things in the Old Testament point to spiritual things in the New, etc. So there is that connection, I do believe, there that we could see between the physical condition of the walls and the people and the spiritual condition at the time of the people. And if we're not careful, we can end up in these same kind of spiritual conditions. Okay, as we continue in chapter 2, again, we get verse 18, the hand of my God that had been upon me for good. Notice the people are going to respond. Let us rise up and build. This would be the Jewish people. They strengthen their hands for good work. And notice in verse 20, highlight that Nehemiah is going to give a strong response back to these people opposing him. So looking at the notes that we just kind of saw highlights thereof, the response of the remnant. Because the hand of God was upon Nehemiah, that we see in verses 8 and 18, they strengthened their hands and rise up and build. So they didn't do that because they're great, they're awesome, they're powerful, they're strong. No, they did that because they saw that the hand of God was upon their leader, and through extension then on them to go ahead and be strengthened and build up these walls. The opposition, though, is going to increase. So don't think because God's with you, don't think because God is, quote unquote for you. Don't think that because you're doing God's will, the opposition is going to go away. In verse 19, we see the opposition increases, but Nehemiah replies with what I would call gospel clarity and boldness. If you notice what he says specifically in verse 20, he says, the God of heaven will make us prosper, and we as servants will rise and build, but you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. That's very bold to speak to your opposition in that kind of way. But that's what I would call a gospel boldness, right? We, the people of God, God is going to prosper us, spiritually speaking, right? But you who are outside of Christ have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem, which I think would equate to no right or portion or claim to heaven, to the new Jerusalem that is to come in the book of Revelation. You have no portion in that as a non-believer until you are born again and become a part of the people of God, of this remnant that God is saving unto himself. Okay, so as we get into chapter 3, now chapter 3 is a little bit different. Chapter 3 gets into one of these long lists that we've seen in the books of Ezra and now in Nehemiah as well. However, before we just say, well, there's not much here, it's just a big long list of names and where they built on the wall, there are some very important points I think to be made. What we're going to do in this chapter is I'm going to show you the different highlights first. There's not a lot of them, but I'll show you the highlights, and then we'll do our notes page at the end to kind of encapsulate the whole chapter and finish out our lesson. So we mentioned, sorry, I have trouble with this name, I guess, Eliasib, the high priest. He gets specifically mentioned. So highlight that. I'll tell you a little bit more about him in our notes section. The sheep gate, that is significant, so you might want to go ahead and highlight that. In verse 5, the nobles would not stoop to serve the Lord. That's interesting, and I don't believe I have that on the notes page, so I'm going to mention this here. We're going to get a bunch of names of different people, both high-ranking people and common people who are working on the wall, who are putting in what they can to build up the wall and participating. But then we get these nobles. The nobles are usually sort of the rich, a lot of, some of the rich folks who are a bit entitled. They wouldn't stoop. In other words, they were too prideful, and they thought this work on the wall was beneath them. It was beneath them to serve the Lord in this way. Whether they thought they were serving the Lord in a higher way, or whether they just weren't serving the Lord at all. This shows pride. And this is not good. This is not a good thing that we see this, all right? And so we see that not all the people were willing to work. Okay, they just really weren't willing to work on this, and largely due to their pride. So as we continue here, I do want you to notice also in verse 12, we have the mention of daughters working. A particular man here, right? Shallum. His daughters were working on the wall. So we'll deal with that in our notes, right? We see the presence of women there. So we continue through the text. And then also we might want to highlight in verse 26, the water gate. That's a very practical highlight. There's a practical reason for the importance of that specific gate. And then as we conclude the chapter, the sheep gate gets mentioned again in verse 32. So I'll start with this because I don't believe I have this on the next slide. It seems like they worked on the wall counterclockwise, starting at the sheep gate, and then counterclockwise worked on the wall all the way around the city, or at least that's the way Nehemiah mentions it. That's how he's going to recount the people, starting at the sheep gate counterclockwise, and he goes through all the different areas of the wall. If you read through the chapter, you notice there was this gate and that gate, the fish gate, the water gate, the sheep gate, all these different gates. And it goes full circle all the way to verse 32 where we get back to the sheep gate. So he really, this was very comprehensive, this detailing, I guess you'd say, of the chapter itself. Now, one more note about this chapter before I give you the final notes here. It seems like all of chapter 3 was likely an independent report that was incorporated by Nehemiah into his memoirs. So this doesn't read like a memoir like the other chapters, right? Which we know a lot of this is Nehemiah's memoirs. This seems like a report that he wrote that he then placed in the memoirs. So just for those of you who are interested in that kind of thing. Okay, so let's finish out our notes for this week. So we see the repairs begin. We mentioned Eliasib in verse 1. Now this high priest was the grandson of Jeshua, the high priest during the first return. So this is, which is the way it's supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be kept in that line. And so we see this line of Jeshua continuing with Eliasib. We don't have much more information on him at this point to make any conclusions about him one way or the other, but he is the grandson of Jeshua. The sheep gate, what's the significance of that? Well, it's located on the northeast corner of the city and was used to bring in the sacrificial animals, which is likely why it says in verse 1 that it was consecrated. This is the only gate that it mentions being consecrated. Almost certainly because this is where the sacrificial animals would be brought in. Obviously, this is significant. This is mentioned in the New Testament. It's mentioned in the Gospels. Jesus refers to the gate often, and we know that he is the sacrifice. And so it's interesting that the sheep gate is where you would bring in the sacrificial animals, right? Women being included, verse 12, we mentioned that, this man with his daughters. Women were included in the rebuilding of the walls to at least some degree. They're the only ones mentioned. Were they the only ones working on it? Possibly. Could there have been more? Possibly. Could there have been many more? Possible. Maybe not as likely to put the word many in there. But we know that women were not excluded from the work. And not only that, but getting back to that mention of these, in verse 5, those nobles who, like, this was beneath them. The women participating in this says a lot. And it says a lot that these nobles were not willing to do that. I'll just kind of leave it there, right? It says quite a bit. And the Bible doesn't mention the daughters for no reason. Okay? It mentions them specifically because we see women involved in the work of building up the walls to God's city. So why such a detailed account? Like, why was this so detailed? Well, the people as a whole, not just the leaders, are vital for accomplishing God's redemptive purpose. And that's a theme in Ezra too. Ezra and Nehemiah really bring that out. Hey, it's not just about the leaders, man. This is the people as a whole. This is the remnant as a whole. Okay? Being important for the accomplishing of God's redemptive purpose. And again, that word, I can't stress it enough, right? That word, redemptive. This is all about God redeeming his people. God is keeping his promise here to redeem his people through the Messiah that's going to come through these people. So very, very important that we see that. And the same thing I would apply today. The superstar pastor is not the one who's solely tasked with God's redemptive purpose. It's the church as a whole. It's the body of Christ as a whole. Right? Is to participate in different ways, in different places, maybe at, to different degrees. But we are all to participate in God's redemptive purpose of proclaiming his gospel to the ends of the earth to bring in the fullness of his remnant, the fullness of his people. And our final note, I do want you to notice in the chapter, and I didn't even count up how many times it says this. It's a lot. All the times where, as he's going through the list, next to, he says next to, right? I'll get you started with that. In verse 4, we see it. We see it again in verse 4. Actually 3 times in verse 4. You see that in verse 5, you see it in verse 7, you see it in verse 8, etc. Next to. And then later in the chapter, okay, starting in around verse 16, you see in 16 after him, 17 after him. You see next to him again in 17, again back to after him in 18. What does this show? The phrase next to and after him show the extreme organization of the work. This work was extremely organized and detailed, and that's why Nehemiah is often used as a book on leadership. Often, Christian business people will use this book to teach proper leadership and organizational skills and these kind of things, and we see that to a great deal with Nehemiah. Okay, of course, we've chosen to focus more on the spiritual side of things, but that is an important point to understand. A couple more things that I might not have typed out here, but just to kind of point out to you before we end our lesson here. If you look at verse 20, on either side of the high priest's house, the work is being done by Levites and priests. So there's a significance to that, not just because of who the high priest was, but flowing into our next note in verse 23, Nehemiah had workers work on sections close to their homes. Now, of course, Levites didn't necessarily have that, but they were near the high priest's home, right? But verse 23, Nehemiah had people work on sections close to their homes to foster personal care, right? If I'm working on something further away from my home, human nature is, I might try to be responsible and do a good job, but my personal care is not there as much. If that's right by my house, oh yeah, I care a lot more. I care a lot more now because I have a personal vested interest in this. So this really was a brilliant organization, I should say, and leadership move. And by the way, verse 26, the Watergate, that I had you highlight. Very simple. That was the main source of water for the city. So that's what the water gate was. And then again, all the way back to chapter 32, the sheep gate, and we already covered the significance of that. So that concludes our teaching lesson this week on Nehemiah chapters 1, 2, and 3. Stay tuned for lesson 8, where we will be covering Nehemiah chapters 4 and 5. I'll see you on the next one.